Great. Thanking that speaker, calling upon the leader of opposition here. Sorry about that.
Okay. I prefer POIs in the chat if you can. 3, 2, 1, go. I'm going to be presenting 2 points. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the everyday independence of stability and why that's important, and why we think in many cases it's more important than gaining independence, even were maintaining instability necessary for gaining independence. Secondly, we're going to talk about why we don't think that maintaining instability is necessary for gaining independence, but rather the opposite. We think it harms your chances of independence, or makes them, or pushes back the day when that will happen. Before I do that, so a stance and then a couple of points of expenditure about it. Firstly, our stance in this debate is that it is the role of you as a leader to maintain stability in the sense of preventing violence, even violence directed against the oppressor, and maintaining law and order more generally, that is to say, preventing property crimes and so on. It doesn't mean that you oppose peaceful protests, the right to make your voice heard. It doesn't mean that you oppose using diplomatic tactics against the oppressor on the international stage or so on. Moving on, let's do some rebuttal. The first thing I want to point out, the first and most important thing, is that what we've heard from the government so far is that instability is important in order to get independence. We have not heard from them why independence is so important, right? As far as I can tell, and I'm sorry if I missed something, not a word on why it is that political independence is something that is worth sacrificing the lives of real people who will be subject to the violence that you will allow to proliferate in your country or territory. Secondly, we hear from that we don't think that their analysis on this point is correct, because all we've heard from them is that a leader is an is a focal point that grants legitimacy to the occupying power. And while in many cases that is correct, if you object to what the occupying power is doing, except in a really strategic, minimal way, then the occupying power will remove you from power and replace you with someone who's willing to play ball with them, right? Because there's lots of people in your country who went to university. There's lots of them who come from wealthy families or respected local leaders or so on. And some of them will be pliable to bribes or fear or what have you in order to do what the occupier wants. And so to the degree that you have any capital with the occupier at all, you should spend it in a more strategic way, and you certainly shouldn't spend it in this way. Moving on, a couple more points of rebuttal, but they will be integrated right. So first, let's talk about the everyday importance of stability. Because like I said, we haven't heard so far from the government why independence is actually all that important. Firstly, we say stability provides freedom from fear. In an unstable society, violence is more common and people fear for their well-being every day. They do not know whether they can walk down the street. They do not know whether they can pop out to the shops after dark without being stabbed or robbed. They fear for themselves and for their loved ones. This permeates every part of their lives, every day of their lives. Living under an occupation, on the other hand, while yes, it can suck really badly, is a thing that limits your political rights. On a day-to-day level, depending on the nature of that occupation and how many rights they provide, and we'll get to that later on, it is entirely possible that you will not come into contact with the occupier very frequently. Now, note that just pointing that violence at the oppressor isn't an option for several reasons. Firstly, because if you point the violence at the oppressor will respond with more violence. Now, we heard from the government that they find it unlikely that the occupying power will indulge in the worst excesses possible. And now this depends greatly on who the occupying power is, right? And we think that this debate runs from like occupying dictatorships like China occupying Tibet to more democratic like countries that are themselves democracies, but also occupying like Britain or Israel, right? And we say that yes, democracies are unlikely to indulge in their worst excesses, but they will still respond with violence to violence, right? If violence is carried out against them, they will send in the troops. Whereas normally they prefer not to send in the troops because they don't want to risk their troops. So long as you're not making any noise, they'd rather not put soldiers there so they can spend them on other things they don't depend, they don't have to risk their life. Secondly, that when weapons and violence training are more common in your society, that means they're also more accessible to people who would then use them for evil. There's just more of it going around. And thirdly, once violence is legitimized as part of the political struggle, it will also be used against people of your own group if they are perceived as obstacles to that political struggle. So if you look at the fighting between Palestinian groups, right, between Fatah and Hamas, where each sees the other as getting in the way of the correct way of carrying out the struggle, because violence was legitimized as part of that struggle. I will take a POI in a moment. Let's talk about, but the second reason why stability is important is the economic prosperity, right? Because if there's violence, if there's crime, it is very difficult for that society to flourish, right? If farms keep getting destroyed by wars, or if people lose their jobs because there's not enough money going around, or things keep getting stolen, people do not have food security. People do not have residential security. They can't be sure they'll be able to pay the rent. People don't have the freedom to maybe eventually move out of that country, or just to make something more of their lives if they want to. And that's important. Before I move on, I will take clothing.
Do you think it's bad to die for your own country's culture and identity?
I think that might suit some people. I don't think you have the right to promote an environment that will cause other people of your countrymen to die for the country, for their country identity, without asking them whether they'd like to. Moving on. Second, we think that we think that maintaining stability is important for realizing political rights. Why? What's important to note here is that political rights are a spectrum. That is to say, do you have elections, right? To what degree are you subject to the oppressor's laws, or the laws that you make? Who's in charge of enforcing those laws, right? Do you have your own police who has some amount of leeway, or is it the occupier's police? Who controls trade? Who controls migration? Who controls the currency, right? All of these things are rights that the oppressor may grant you or not grant you, right? Grant you, I mean strictly in a practical sense, right? Philosophically, they may have no right whatsoever to grant you any of those things. That doesn't matter. In practice, they're the people in charge, right? With that in mind, instability moves you towards the full occupation, full clampdown end of the spectrum. How so? Firstly, because instability sabotages your use of whatever rights the oppressor is willing to let you keep. Right? In a country, in a country or territory where violence is rampant, it's very difficult to have free and open elections because people will have violent retribution if they vote for the wrong person. Right? Secondly, you need economic prosperity and institutions for when you do get independence, or else you're never going to be able to make anything of yourself, and your country will immediately will collapse again. Thirdly, you need recognition from the international community. You need to be able to tell the United Nations or whoever it is, okay, that look what they're doing to us. We could govern ourselves if we wanted to, but now we can't do that if we want to do, but you can't do that if your country isn't functioning economically and in terms of law and order, right? And for those reasons, we beg to oppose.